Within an investigation into the phenomenology of perception by way of a personal practice in soundography as mapping space through sound, this presentation aims to delineate fundamental characteristics distinguishing the form and praxis of sound art established in a comparison with the traditional concept of music composition of Western art. The beginning of the 21st century has seen the flourishing and rapid development of what has often been termed sound art. This form of composition in sound has proliferated and increased constantly through experiments and research, and as a result, the space in which sound art is produced and experienced has been modified. Like many genres of contemporary art, sound art may be interdisciplinary or taking a hybrid form. Because of the diversity of sound art, the boundaries with the domains of visual art or experimental music are often blurred. The emergence of this novel form of production, organization, and recording of sound has also brought into question similarities and differences with traditional forms of composition and music making. I maintain that space is fundamental conditions out of which sound art is intrinsically constructed, perceived, and emplaced. A space not only envisioned or alluded to as in composition, but space that is the very lure of sonic art expressed in its physical actualizations. By designating space as the specific quality that distinguishes sonic art from traditional compositions, I will investigate what species of space is under consideration and what sorts of tradition in composition to look at. To proceed with such evaluations, I will follow a phenomenological path to unfold an experience of the surrounding space perceived as a soundographic map. I will address what are the characteristics of the space, its acoustic quality, and what sort of composition procedures are investigated. How those sounds are different from the composition and how eventually do the two relate to each other. The common denominator of this diverse range of sound experiences is space. What follows is a soundographic of everyday life, a sound map of the routine pathway from home to work. The audio recording of this experience has gone through multiple iterations. The average length of the pathway and therefore of the uninterrupted sound recording is about 50 minutes. The process has been repeated for a month on weekdays, respectively in early morning and late afternoon. This resulted in 54 recordings of the pathway, each 50 minutes long, a total of more than 45 hours of audio recording. I'm leaving home, taking a walk toward the subway station that after 25 minutes ride will take me near to my working place. I shut the door behind me and proceed to the nearest lift. After pushing a circular button, a purple arrow-shaped light appears in the center of it. A bell-like sounds follow. At the right of the lift, a second bell sound signals the opening of the doors. The lift takes me to the ground floor, where a third bell sound marks the opening of the lift doors again. I could extract, thinking compositionally, the temporality of the aforementioned events, lay them down on a paper, notating the individual duration of the sound heard in order to have appearance as being captured by the audio recording. The shutting of the apartment door, 7 steps to the lift, the first lift bell sound followed by the second lift bell, 2 steps to enter the lift door shuts, the sounds of the lift cable uncoiling to get me to the ground floor, the lift doors opening, the third lift bell sound, stepping out. By doing this, I will have, for lack of a better word, transposed the physical space which I moved through into a planar space, a space divided by points and lines on a plan. During this procedure, a good number of alterations will have occurred. From shutting the apartment door to stepping out of the lift onto the ground floor, the experience was a combined experience of all the senses, but is now, on paper, mainly, or perhaps solely, visual. What was tactile, oral, aromatic, possibly even gustatory, is now on a piece of paper a string of signs devoid of any acoustic or semantic content. I should specify that when I hint at the so-called 5 senses, I'm well aware that this delineation is cultural in nature, for the varieties of sensory experience cannot be completely contained within the broad distinction of 5 senses, but depend on localized context and experiential references. I refer to the traditional 5 senses solely with the intent to bring to the surface, to provide an entry point to an otherwise much more complex phenomenological unfolding of the experience. By transposing onto a piece of paper the few sonic events between closing the apartment door to the moment I step out of the lift at the ground floor, I retain certain elements of what happened, a succession of acoustic attacks, the duration of the sounds and their dynamics. But many other elements are lost in translation, simplified by the very act of drawing sign onto a bidimensional plan. A good number of other sounds have occurred between those mentioned above: indistinct noises of neighbors, distant road traffic, bird passing by. Nuances in the layering of multiple sonic events are lost because my attention is directed at something and therefore not attentive to something else. And regardless of whether I attempt to capture all this event on the piece of paper or on the written score, what is missed is much more evident than what is retained. The modality of sound perception is directly related to the signs chosen and then written on the square of paper, a modality which seems to allude, suggest, or establish what is presented and what is concealed within the shape of the symbols and the size of the paper. The tempo of the sounds involved cannot be replicated even once, as none of them is verbatim the same at any given moment. Every individual iteration of the Lift's bell is modulated by indistinct surrounding sound, never the same, never in the same order. The experience itself is punctuated beyond the timbre of sound itself by more sensory feedback that alters, modulates, or colors the sound. Moreover, by tracing signs, lines, dots, and symbols on a piece of paper, we are determining an orientation, a movement towards something or away from something else, a linear unfolding of events whose directionality seems to assume that sound has a given linear trajectory in physical space. The experience of hearing sound in space with and through the body is nonetheless a very different phenomenon. Sound that envelopes, comprises, and permeates the space and the bodies within. While a sound source can be perceived as reaching us from left or right in relation to our position, the sound itself irradiates, when not limited by barriers or other surfaces, spreading spherically from its source. A phenomenological relationship between sound and space unfolding within the present moment appears to be a peculiarity of many forms of sound art. The presence in space of our body is fundamental, and listening to the sound is an experience that unfolds synchronously within the shared space of the event. As opposed to a written music score which is always past or future, never present, the score has been written and afterwards performed, or it will be performed sometimes in the future. The score that is performed now, in this very moment, has been written in the past. The music is not present in its becoming, even if the performer is playing sounds read from the score. The music written in the score was or will be, it is not in the now. Here, a further distinction between written and performed music is fundamental. The gap between the two acts is hardly welded down by signs engraved on a piece of paper. Many forms of sound art seems to evade differentiation with an act of making and hearing that coagulate in the present moment within the given space. I'm walking out of the building, and I follow a well-known path that leads me to the subway station. To cross the road, I need to wait for a double signal from the street crossing light. A changing of the light from red to green, accompanied by a change of sounds emitted by the apparatus. Here I suddenly recall my lift, purple light to call the elevator, two different sounds for the opening and closing of the doors. Here the space is resounding, simultaneously unfolding in front of me, step by step. A kinetic experience together with a tactile experience which is modulated by a visual and oral one. A space that is traveled, touched and smelled. A space that is a lived emplacement of the body. Space traced, perceived, projected, envisioned, experienced, modified, translated, constructed, deconstructed, temporalized, perhaps denied. How many different functions and modalities of space ever exist, and how many different methods of transformation or techniques of modulating space? How, accordingly, should we consider space in relation to the broad definition of sound art, or the specificities of its different manifestations? Limiting this to a few categories are sound sculpture, installation, performance, intertwined form of a sound art whose common denominator is space. If the audio recording of a 50 minutes walk of my personal practice is heard without walking the path, is the experience the same or at least similar to being in the actual space of the soundographic experiment? If I watch a video of a sound sculpture or an installation rather than being in the space where these structures are, am I participating in the event as if I were there in the space itself? It could be argued that the above applies equally to music composed and recorded and listened to through a sound system of some sort. Nonetheless, there is an essential difference between the species of space in a sound sculpture or installation and the space of a recording session. The space of the latter is not directly experienced by the receiving listener, except in rare circumstances. The space of a studio recording is indeed a known space. When we listen to a sound recording, the physical space we are in at the listening moment and the acoustic space we hear from the loudspeakers or headphones are of a completely different natures. The former is a space leaving, an emplacement of the body. The latter is a space of event we never directly leave, unless the listener and the performer are one and the same. An audio recording requires the listener to assume or envision a space, to give a dimension to it, an acoustic quality, perhaps an appearance and a design, features of a non-experienced space. A consideration should be made for the performance space on its own, both for sound art and for concert performance in the traditional sense. In the latter case, how the space is perceived and shared from a listener and performer's perspectives appear to be less evident. However, there are important distinctions worth mentioning. In a traditional context of music performance, space is canonically defined by attributes that mostly disregard the specificity of music being performed. The acoustic design considerations of a venue are mostly generic. A concert hall is required to fulfill characteristics that encompass any sort, or at least the majority of conventional music events. Site-specific events in music are a relatively recent phenomenon, more akin to the peculiarities of sound art rather than the convention of traditional music performance. Moreover, in the context of theater, concert halls, and venue with a traditional design, the distinction between audience and performance space is usually well established, especially demarcated by the presence of the stage where the performers operate and the seating arrangement where the audience listen and watch. This is rarely the case for sound art, where beside the purposeful utilization of venue with a particular design, the space is often shared organically with the audience, and seating arrangements are ad hoc or entirely unspecified. Regardless, the very distinction between seating and stage is most likely absent, which implies a clear rupture with the traditional concert hall setting. The proximity and interaction between performer and the audience is a further characteristic of sound art performances. Crossing the invisible boundaries of the space of performance and the space of the listener prompts a partaking of the space on multiple levels: auditory, kinesthetic, visual, tactile, olfactory. By navigating through space rather than assuming a static seated position at a fixed distance from the performer, the mobile bodies of participants, audience and performers alike, provoke acoustic modulations. Sounds is dynamically moving across, amplified or attuned by the ambulation of participants, by their choices of closeness or remoteness to performers and the other participants in the event. By walking into the subway station through a maze of descending escalators, I arrive in front of the entrance gate. I tap a card, the light switches from red to green, accompanied by the distinct sounds, and the gates open. I recall my lift a second time. While waiting at the platform, announcements in 4 different languages, English, Chinese, Malaysian, and Hindi, emphasize what to do and what not, what to be aware of, how to behave in such and such situations. The train approaches, the doors open and close with 2 distinct sounds, accompanied by the red and green light, and an announcement to reinforce the action that is happening, again in 4 languages. To get to my working place, a good number of stops are in between, the same opening and closing of the car's doors. I will recall my lift 11 times. The experiment soundography explicitly raises the question of the source material, the nature of the sound heard, recorded, stored, again listened to, and perhaps performed. Throughout the path from a residential to the working place, I could distinguish and broadly categorize sounds as belonging to different sources: electromechanical, lifts, vehicles, street lights, elevators, subway doors; natural, birds, insects, and other animals, caused by the changes of weather such as wind, rain, thunderstorm; human, voices, announcements, cries, screams, its distinct chapters. The orchestration of sounds is not given beforehand, and the composition of the emergence is continuously modulated by the environment, the moving bodies, the presence or absence of the listener in the determined position in space, in a space that is imbued with sounds regardless of our presence. A further distinction emerges here in terms of expectation for traditional compositions. A sound installation, a sound sculpture, maintains a fundamental relationship with the space in which it is situated. A rapport that is possible eludes the presence of a human body. Sound is space that acts regardless of the vicinity of a listener. On the other hand, live performance or the recording of music composition assumes the existence of an audience, someone at some point in time in a certain space. Without the presence of an audience, a live performance is a different activity, a rehearsal, a practice, a playful time alone or with other musicians. Here once more space distinguishes the modality of sound art and performed composition. The former happens in a space imbued with sound that is evolving, notwithstanding the physical presence of an audience. The latter requires an audience to be considered as a current or complete event. I stumble upon apparent contradictions. Early in this presentation, I established that the physical presence of the human body in the actual space of a sound art event is a condition that differentiates sound art from the traditional form of written composition. At the same time, I maintained that the sound installation or sound sculpture acts in the space regardless of the presence of a listener, an affirmation that seems to contradict my previous one. This ambiguity is resolved if we keep in mind that the quality of space is the criterion that establishes the difference. A living and breathing space for sound art in which objects and bodies are equally permeated with sounds. A fictitious space for performance or composed music where space is more often a backdrop. I need to be in the space to experience a sound installation, but the installation doesn't need me to endure and unfold in its own space. I do not need to be in the concert hall to listen to a string quartet, but to be defined as a live event, the string quartet and the concert hall needs me. In sound art, the liveness of the space is a fundamental part of the genetic material out of which sound is conjured as material. The environment, the specific site, the organic relations with the characteristic of the space itself. In a live performance of a music composition, the space is of a second order of importance. However, without an audience, a performance is not anymore live as such. The space will be silent, or it will be resonant for no one. Sound art seems to rely on physical space for its existence. It does not rely solely on a performative outcome. Music compositions can get away from the specificity of performance space while still existing on paper or in digital format in virtual spaces. The relationship here to venues, concert hall, theaters is non-specific. I do not deny the presence of a form of music composition that takes spatialization into account, or which includes the specific design of a space as part of the compositional process. I notice, however, that in most cases the experiments in this spatialization are in vitro and are rarely made in the organic space in which a performance will take place. Works of composers that have dedicated their writing to electronic and spatialization, Caroline Stockhausen, Milton Babbitt, Yanis Xenakis to many few, has been restaged several times in completely heterogeneous spaces. It appeared that in most cases the composer's intention was specific as to the treatment of frequencies, pitches, interval, tone, and interrelationships of sound sources and sound outputs, number of channels for example, are less reliant of the nature of the space where the piece could be performed. Moreover, a compelling issue is in relation to the technological difficulties of reproducing the original spatial configuration of such works, with an established commercial standard for hearing such music. Works conceived as multi-channel outputs are often reduced to binaural output for the sake of listening capabilities of headphones and standard telephonic system. A space which was originally conceived and tested out is completely dissipated and reshaped by later technological adaptation. I'm about to come to the end of my little soundographic trip. Upon exiting the subway station, a number of operations are identical, although reverse. Getting out of the train car, exiting the train station gates, following the escalators up to the floor level. After a short walk, I arrived at the entrance of my workplace. I need to scan a card to pass security, a first buzzing sound. To access the lift, I scan the same card again, a second buzzing sound. I scan once more to open the door's entrance at the desired floor, followed by the tap for the office entrance, the administration, the meeting room, the rooftop, a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, and a seventh buzzing sound. By approaching the center of the city, the quantity of sounds from mechanical devices seems to increase. Buzzes, alarms, blips, clicks, hums, horns, whistles, bells. It is a cornucopia of man-made sounds which amalgamate and often obliterate the sounds of birds, insects, and wind. We are never alone. Sounds are incessantly surrounding us. This is specifically noticeable in the noisy hustle of metropolis and big urban and suburban cities. Walking the city streets, I recall some of the early and mid-20th century experiments in musique concrète and acousmatic music of Pierre Schaeffer, Pierre Henry, Luc Ferrari, Edgar Varèse, Pierre Boulez, among others. I recall that most of these avant-garde experiments playfully but seriously investigate as mechanical device for sound reproduction and editing, and use techniques of montage, splicing physical magnetic tape. I also noticed that most of the sound sources were mechanical or conversely human, voice spoken or sung. The works of an electroacoustic device paired with traditional musical instruments seems to land in a different area of research, Mario Davidovsky, John Cage, Alvin Lucet, Luigi Nono, again to name a few. Obviously, there were overlaps and ambiguities. The heterogeneous catalog I've just provided is indeed provisional and circumscribed by the scope of this research presentation. However, it seems clear that from the beginning of the 20th century, music composition and emergent sound art becomes attentive to the environment, to the specificity of space, which triggered a plethora of sonic research and explorations, supplemented by mechanical and technological developments of devices meant to record, edit, and playback sounds and music. While it is almost unseemly to address such a vast field of inquiry with an even more broad definition of this era ushered in by the umbrella term sonic arts, I venture to draw a few observations which I hope will not outrage anyone. My little excursus into sound art through my personal project Soundography seems to suggest that space is the sine qua non specific to some sculpture, sound installations, sound performance, and the capacious definition of some art. A space which has completely different significance, relevance, and liveness when compared to other forms of music making, for example composition as traditionally conceived in Western art. Furthermore, the presence or absence of human beings in the space of sonic art events has a very different meaning in relationship to the happening, and again the difference is striking when compared to the condition of listening to music in whatever space and time via digital or analog devices, traditional venues, loudspeakers, headphones, mobile phones, to name a few. Sonic art seems to require space which is specific and often sui generis, and the listening that is equally particular, attuned and situated within the very space and time where the event is taking place. Exceptions exist throughout the field of the arts, and I'm sure that capable scrutinizer will find plenty of counterexamples to thicken the plot. But I hope that this presentation will spark questions rather than providing more lex scripta, and that this writing will engender further investigation into the polymorphic and provocative field of sound art.